Hello, and welcome to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And welcome to part 2 of the lecture regarding the original 6 civilizations. Now, as always, take a moment, pause this video, jot down the rest of the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key words on your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off talking about Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Indus Valley, and then a little bit about the migrations that occurred between the regions. We're going to pick up this lecture part with the Yellow River civilization, specifically China. Now, you may be asking yourself, if you're taking a Western civilization course, why are we learning about China and not just Europe, the West? Here's my contention, and feel free to disagree. Number one is the West, Europe, did not occur or rise in a vacuum. They borrowed ideas. They had amalgamations of culture and religion and trade from other areas, whether Africa or whether the quote-unquote East, places like India and China, Southeast Asia. And so it's important in my mind that we understand, number one, Europe does not rise in a vacuum. Number two, that we should never teach what I was taught back in the day, which was there's this evolution of progress from the Greeks to the Romans to the Europeans to the Americans, and we're all great. No, there are other people too, and we should never want to be ethno or egocentric. And then finally, number three, as most students are well aware from learning in high school, there's things like the Indian Ocean trade and the Silk Road trade that connect Europe to Asia and Southeast Asia particularly. In which case, if you haven't covered what's going on there, they don't make as much sense. So, we're starting today with China. So, let's begin. First and foremost, much like the other ones we talked about, whether it's the Nile River in Egypt or the Tigris-Euphrates in Mesopotamia or the Indus River in the Indus Valley civilization, China is going to start along a river basin. And the Banpo region is going to start along the Yellow River. This water source began from a high plateau in Tibet. It carried soil that had a yellow tint to it, hence the term Yellow River. And in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, around 1600 BCE, the Yellow River Basin is going to give rise to the first civilization in China. Now, agriculture was difficult because much like Mesopotamia, and unlike the Egyptian rivers, the Yellow River was very unpredictable in its flooding, which required that small city-state communities coordinate and cooperate in order to deal with flood control and irrigation. And so while the Neolithic Revolution took place around 5000 BCE, and we do see the beginnings of the first societies in this region around 5000 BCE, and you see on the screen highlighted the Banpo people, you see images of it on the screen right now as far as what we think it might have looked like due to excavations. It isn't until around 2200 BCE that we finally begin to get the first real civilization. And this was the Xia dynasty. In Xia, it's spelled Xia, we will get our first dynastic leader with the legendary King Yu, spelled Yu. And he became a local hero for flood control purposes. And he develops the first dynasty in Chinese history, the Xia dynasty. Now, again, fairly small, but within the southern and eastern realm of the Xia dynasty, there arose another dynasty. This becomes the first main concrete dynasty in Chinese history that we have a lot of evidence for, and that is the Shang dynasty. And again, it's birthed in the southern and eastern part of the Xia lands. And we have many written records and material that has been discovered. We know that they had engaged in bronze metallurgy, that bronze was monopolized by a ruling elite. We know that they created agricultural surpluses to feed the people and support a large troop population for military use. They had a vast network of walled towns. And we know that the Shang capital moved 6 times, but also the Shang dynasty kings and emperors would have lavish tombs indicating that they were definitely concerned about the afterlife. They were often buried with chariots and weapons, bronze goods. There were sacrificial human victims, along with dogs and horses. Now, by 1122, so from 1766 until 1122 BCE, so we're talking a good 600 years here, the Shang dynasty ruled this expanded Yellow River civilization. Well, the last of the Shang dynasty was a particularly weak ruler. And whenever a severely weak ruler takes power, there's often an uprising, a coup. In this case, the Zhous. The Zhou dynasty is going to oust the last ruler of the Shang dynasty. And it's under the Zhou dynasty that we get this idea of the mandate of heaven. And you see the cycle, the dynastic cycle on the screen. The Zhou dynasty is going to, because what it needs to do, number one, is justify, wait, you just overthrew the king, the emperor. How is that possible? And the idea of the mandate of heaven is that this ruler is chosen by God, and this person is going to bring peace. This person is going to bring stability. It's going to bring expansion. It's going to bring good times. And as long as that's the case, that emperor maintains that mandate of heaven. But when you start getting a weak ruler who begins to tax the people too much, who begins to stop protecting the people enough, who lets the infrastructure decay, that is a signal to the people at large that ruler, the emperor, has lost the mandate. And then it's time for a peasant revolt, in which case there will be a large revolt among the peasantry. And there may be a short warring states period where we can't quite choose a new leader. And eventually a prominent warrior will arise, and they will claim the title of emperor, and who will assume this mantle, the mandate of heaven, who will then bring peace, who will rebuild infrastructure, who will expand. And this becomes a very important concept, yes, in Chinese history, but we also see it later on in European history. And while it's not called the mandate of heaven, it's still the idea of kind of the God king on earth, often through the authority of the church in this case. Now, under the Zhou dynasty, we're going to see the first full monarchical rule, dynastic succession. They're going to exercise feudal-like control of the territories, where basically local lords will have to pay tribute to the emperor, much like we'll see later on in feudal Europe. We will see a decentralized administration where local authorities have power as long as they stay in line and they stay allegiant to the king, or the emperor. The consequence, however, is it does give rise to regional powers, which again is fine in theory until you have a weak central ruler, in which case the process begins all over. Now, much like other areas, there is a definite hierarchy here. At the top is the emperor and ruling elites. There's a royal family. There's allied nobles who have essentially bent the knee. They will have lavish consumption of bronze products, later silk. There will be hereditary aristocrats who will basically be families of wealth, generations of wealth. Now, the main difference here is in China, the aristocracy will also often be warriors. And eventually, these will be kind of warrior poets, and they'll be educated and literate, and they'll be expected to not only perform militarily, but also politically, and also within the arts. Like other areas, once you create a sedentary society, you create specialized labor. There will be free artisans and craftsmen and tradesmen, and these will, of course, they will serve the needs of the empire, the ruling elites. The merchants are also very important. Now, on the one hand, these merchants are going to bring a variety of goods in and out of China. Things like jade, things like technology and weapon technology from both Asia and Mesopotamia, tin from Southeast Asia. And there's even some pottery found from Mohenjo-daro in the Indus Valley. Now, that said, despite the fact that these merchants and traders play a very prominent role, despite the fact that they bring wealth to the empire, they're often looked at with disdain, and they're seen lower on the spectrum of the hierarchy than most other nations. China is a little weird in that. China does tend to put farmers above merchants, where most of the world will put merchants on top, then peasants. But nonetheless, merchants, also peasants, who are, of course, and as elsewhere, the largest population group. These landless peasants provide labor. They live in small subterranean houses, and women perform specific roles such as winemaking, weaving, and silkworm raising for the future silk trade. We also see a variety of wood, bone, and stone tools before iron was spread in the 6th century BCE. There were also slaves, mostly war prisoners who performed hard labor. And this becomes very prominent in the Shang dynasty, and then will translate into the Zhou dynasty. And much like the Shang dynasty, in the Zhou dynasty, we will see elaborate burial sites for the emperors. We will see that often that the emperor is buried with human sacrifices, along with lavish goods, materials, war materials, etc. They subsist on wheat, rice, and millet, so grain crops. And what we do start seeing here also is the creation of religion in China. Now, they did believe in ancestor worship early on. We see evidence of that on the picture on your right, which is the oracle bones. Now, the oracle bones, they sound like some kind of mystical fortune-telling thing, but the reality is what they were, however, was bone, stone, they put writing on it. And it was meant to record the history of the kings. And so you can actually say early Chinese history was polytheistic. And there was a supreme deity. But that will change very quickly as we move forward in Chinese history. They will have chariots. There will be iron working by, again, 6th century BCE. Iron weapons, compound bows, and we start seeing the early formation of Chinese writing and calligraphy. Again, these are the earliest form of Chinese writing, and it starts with pictographs, and it moved to ideographs. And because they did not have an alphabet or phonetic component, the language did not necessarily match the writing, which is often the case even in modern Mandarin Chinese, that you have characters that don't necessarily phonetically transfer to an alphabet. In addition, we see the formation of this early writing, producing a number of books: the Book of Change, the Book of History, the Book of Rites, the Book of Songs. And you can see on your screen what each one was, but these are notably the most classic works of Chinese history. There are both themes that are lighthearted and serious. They reflect the social conditions of the Zhou dynasty. But one thing that does tend to permeate throughout is this idea that the emperor has the mandate of heaven, and they're very concerned with social, cultural issues and moral issues that maintain peace and order. Now, what happens at the end? Well, nomadic invasions begin to attack. Nomads begin to attack the Zhous. starting about in 711 BCE. The territorial princes become more independent. The Zhou dynasty has weak rulers, just a couple of them. And then from 403 to 221 BCE, we enter what's called the Warring States period, where technically there is a Zhou emperor, but he's all figurehead, no power. And what really has happened is the individual regional rulers are fighting among themselves for power and control, hence the term Warring States period. Finally, the last Zhou emperor will abdicate his position in 256 BCE, and we will continue this Warring States period until a new dynasty is born, a new mandate of heaven. That's in China. And again, we'll return to that topic later on in China. At the exact same time, however, as we're talking about this Mesopotamia, Egyptian Nile, Indus Valley, Yellow River, there were simultaneous formation across the ocean in what is Mesoamerica, modern-day Mexico. And again, Mesoamerica is kind of a fluid term. It covers about half of Mexico south into Central America, into places like Honduras and El Salvador. Now, around the same time, around 1200 BCE, we are going to see the creation of the first Mesoamerican major civilization called the Olmecs. Now, what happened here? And again, there's some debate of when this happened, but essentially, most historians point to somewhere between 30 and 40,000 years ago. Hunter-gatherer groups crossed over from Russia to Alaska and either walked south through Canada into what is now the United States, into Mexico, or they got on a boat near Alaska and then followed the coastline down into modern-day Mexico. And around 7,000 BCE, they will reach the southern tip of South America. Now, there's another variation of that, which would be a seafaring route from Polynesia, where they travel across the ocean simply, and again, for lack of a better term, think of the movie Moana. They travel across the ocean, great distances to find new lands and peoples. But again, either way it happens, people were here in the Americas. And in Mesoamerica in particular, by 1200, we see the creation of this large Olmec civilization. It's often referred to as the mother culture of Mesoamerica because many later societies, the ones you've heard of, like the Toltecs, the Mayans, the Aztecs, they all built on that Olmec tradition. The main cultural center was San Lorenzo or La Venta. They were ruled by a powerful elite that seemingly combined both religious and political authority into one person or one small group. They grew maize, beans, and squash. They were supported by local hunting and fishing. And we know they were engaged in long-distance trade of jade, obsidian, and other valuable metals. This trade went both north and south. North into what is modern-day Mexico City and later into the United States, and south into South America, like places like Peru. They also, not only did they grow the maize, beans, and squash, the Holy Trinity, the Three Sisters, but rather they also grew things like avocados, gourds, chili peppers. But by 5000 BCE, we have the creation of a stable maize crop where they can start growing larger civilizations. We start seeing agricultural villages by 300 BCE before finally giving way in 1200 BCE to the Olmec populations. Now, it is worth noting here, unlike places in Afro-Eurasia, there were no large pack animals in Mesoamerica, and therefore, Mesoamerica is very slow to develop the wheel. Unlike places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, there was no need to develop a wheel in Mesoamerica because there was no pack animals, beasts of burden, to domesticate, to pull carts. The only real pack animal that could be domesticated was in Peru, which was the alpaca and the llama. But elsewhere in North America, Mesoamerica, there simply were not beasts of burden to domesticate. So what do they do there? Well, again, they have the structure. You have your elite priests and rulers on top. You have your farmers, your artisans, your traders on bottom. And then below them are slaves, which are usually through warfaring, captives. We believe that was very authoritarian in nature. It was often a theocratic rule. In other words, there was religious rule. And we do believe they had a kind of a city-state system similar to places like Mesopotamia. Of course, their greatest known feature was those giant, colossal human heads. We still don't quite fully understand what they are. We speculate that they were of the rulers to kind of commemorate the kings and rulers of the Olmec people, but we're not 100% sure. What we do know is that these giant heads are reminiscent of monument building like we see of the pyramids in Egypt. We also know that they produced the first early Mesoamerican calendar. There was a lot of jade and obsidian carving. Now, the fall of the Olmecs still remains a mystery. On the one hand, we speculate probably famine or warfare caused the demise. What is odd about them is that they seem to systematically destroy their own ceremonial centers, which is not normal for a group. And so maybe some larger calamity, maybe it was religious in purpose that they felt the need to destroy their own stuff. But nonetheless, by 400 BCE, other societies, the Toltecs and later the Mayans, will replace the Olmecs. But important legacies: maize production, so corn. Ceremonial centers that will eventually develop into full temples in the Mayan era. Things like ritual of human sacrifice, the ball game. If you ever study anything about Mesoamerican history, the ball game is important. The calendar. Now, once again, the Olmecs did not leave a written record, and therefore we don't fully know all the details as yet, unlike their successors, the Aztecs and the Mayas, which we'll talk about at a future date. Now, just to their south, in modern-day Peru, a second Mesoamerican, early American civilization occurs. It's called the Chavín culture, the Chavín civilization. This is the highlands of present-day Peru. The Chavín civilization flourished from about 900 to 200 BCE. Again, there's some overlap here with those Olmecs. And it was centered on a ceremonial site called Chavín de Huántar. They were less an empire than they were a religious network that seemed to unite diverse Andean communities through shared rituals and iconography. It seemed like the religion and trade both were controlled by the same priest, and the priestly elite held tremendous influence, using elaborate ceremonies, monumental architecture, even hallucinogenic rituals to maintain authority. And again, even today, you can go to Peru and participate in what's called ayahuasca, which is a hallucinogenic trip that is done under a spiritual, priestly, shaman type person. Also of note, they had a lot of feline cat imagery that we believe represents either a jaguar or a puma, and most likely was considered a godlike figure. They cultivated potatoes and quinoa, and as I mentioned earlier, they had llamas to actually herd and domesticate. Now, they built some large stone temples. They had advanced drainage systems to handle heavy rainfall, which is important in mountain areas. They also worked in gold and copper and were skilled textile weavers. So again, this is bringing a high level of civilization, even though they weren't a full-fledged empire yet. Now, how do we conclude this? Well, first and foremost, there's a lot of overlap here, right? Number one, all 6 of these civilizations, all 6 emerged in fertile areas with a reliable water source, even if that flooding was unsure, uncertain. Agricultural surplus was the foundational principle. Social hierarchies would develop everywhere where these larger societies developed. And along with this would include specialization of labor. All also developed long-distance trade networks. It was a hallmark of civilization. Each also developed a centralized authority, whether a king, a pharaoh, an emperor, a priestly elite. Most all will develop law codes, whether it's the Hammurabi's code, whether it's dynastic codes and laws of either Shang China or pharaohs in Egypt. Most all were polytheistic, religious. Many focused on nature. Again, gods of the sun, the moon, the stars, the wind, because those were things that people wanted to control. Given the fact that drought, famine, too much water, not enough water, too much sun, not enough sun, are all very real, tangible problems. The other big theme was fertility, because people wanted to expand their people. And along with that then came monumental religious buildings or religious architecture. You want to build temples to worship or appease your gods. We also see a tremendous technology growth, whether it's from stone to bronze tools. Writing systems in almost every area will create their own writing system. Again, a few exceptions there that the Olmecs did not, but we'll get them the next generation. We'll get a writing system. We also see tremendous agricultural and irrigation innovation. Because again, you've got to control the water. You've got to be able to irrigate your crops to sustain a large population. So these 6 civilizations, and then they're kind of their intermediaries on the outskirts and the peripheries, are going to set the stage for the next era of world history, known as the Classical Era, or Classical Era empires. These core legacies, however, of writing, cities, centralized bureaucracies and states, and religious traditions, along with trade, are going to set the stage and create a legacy to follow that will allow the next era empires to develop. And while there are some differences, most of those differences involve adapting to the local environment. Again, no 2 civilizations are exactly identical because every environment faced is different. So, next topic, Classical Age empires. So until then, take care and bye-bye.